The official history says tall buildings became possible in 1885 when the steel frame and the mechanical elevator arrived together in Chicago. But in St. Petersburg, Brussels, Vienna, and Paris, there are buildings with official construction dates in the 1820s and 1830s whose upper-story window proportions tell a different structural story. Windows that large, at that height, in load-bearing masonry, shouldn't exist. And yet there they are, in the cities most associated with the civilization the maps called Tartaria. Before I tell you what I found, let me tell you what the official account says about tall buildings. The official account says that multi-story construction above a certain height, roughly 5 or 6 stories, became possible only after 2 specific technological developments occurred in combination. The first was the steel or iron structural frame, which transferred the load of the building from the exterior masonry walls to an internal skeleton, allowing taller structures without the massively thickening lower walls that load-bearing masonry required. The second was the mechanical elevator, which made upper floors practically accessible to occupants rather than accessible only to people willing to climb the number of stairs required. The Home Insurance Building in Chicago, 1885, is the conventional landmark for the combination of these 2 technologies in the first purpose-built office skyscraper. Before 1885, the official account says, tall buildings existed, but they were not functional in the skyscraper sense. Cathedrals and church towers rose to extraordinary heights, but their interiors were not floors of occupable space. Residential buildings in certain dense urban environments, Edinburgh's Old Town, for instance, or certain parts of Paris, reached 6 or 8 stories. But the upper floors were barely habitable, accessed by narrow winding stairs, occupied by the poorest residents who couldn't afford the lower floors, the vertical equivalent of the urban margin. The official account of vertical construction before the steel frame is a narrative of limitation, of buildings that reached up despite the technology, rather than because of it. And then I started looking at specific cases that the official account doesn't address directly. Not the famous pre-steel towers, not the cathedrals and campaniles and obelisks and monuments that everyone acknowledges as tall structures without functional upper floors. Specific buildings in specific cities with official construction dates in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s, whose physical evidence does not match the limitation narrative. Let me give you the most straightforward case first. The Singer Building in St. Petersburg, Russia, now known as the House of Books, was officially completed in 1904 and sits at 7 stories. But it sits within, and this is the specific observation I want to stay with, a block of buildings along Nevsky Prospect whose official construction dates span from the 1760s to the 1850s, and whose facades, whose window configurations, whose vertical proportions are consistent with structures of 5, 6, 7 stories of habitable space. The buildings that surround the Singer Building, the buildings officially built in the 1760s through 1850s, have the proportional vocabulary of multi-story habitable construction, not the gradually thickening walls of massive masonry, not the narrow windows of load-bearing stone walls carrying great vertical weight. The proportions and window configurations of buildings that were designed from the start to be inhabited at height. This raises the question I keep returning to. If these buildings, with their official 18th and early 19th century construction dates, were built with masonry techniques, how do their facades show the proportional vocabulary of steel frame construction? Why do the windows on the upper stories of buildings officially built in the 1820s have the kind of generous proportions that the official account says, only became possible with the steel frame. Let me be precise about what proportions I'm describing. Load-bearing masonry construction requires walls that thicken as the building rises, adding mass to support the cumulative load. This thickening has consequences for window size. The windows in the upper stories of a tall masonry building must be narrower than the windows in the lower stories, because the wall mass at upper levels is carrying less load, but is still required to maintain structural continuity. The upper story windows of genuine tall masonry buildings are therefore typically smaller, narrower, and less generous than the lower story windows. The window proportion changes as you move up the facade. The buildings I'm looking at don't show this pattern. Their upper story windows are comparable in proportion to their lower story windows. Sometimes the upper windows are slightly smaller, as the official story would predict, but the reduction is far less dramatic than the structural engineering of tall masonry would require. The facades look, when you analyze their window proportions floor by floor, as if the building's structure is distributing load through a mechanism that doesn't require progressive wall thickening. Which is what a steel or iron frame does. Which is the technology that the official account says didn't exist until the 1880s. Now, there are explanations for this within the conventional framework. Skilled masonry construction can achieve better upper-story window proportions than the simplified narrative suggests. Composite construction, masonry with embedded iron or timber elements, was used in sophisticated buildings before the steel frame became standard. The proportional analysis I'm describing is not a proof. It is an anomaly, a set of observations that are slightly harder to explain than they should be if the official account is complete. But the anomalies cluster. They cluster geographically in specific cities that appear most prominently in the discussion of the inheritance period, the period when new administrative powers were moving into existing urban infrastructure. St. Petersburg, Prague, Vienna, Brussels, the central districts of Paris, the older core of Chicago and New York, below the 20th century's redevelopment. The cities where the pre-reset architectural vocabulary is most concentrated are the cities where the window proportion anomalies are most apparent, and the decades in which the anomalous buildings were officially constructed are consistently in the pre-1850 window. The window before the official introduction of the technologies that should have been required to build them. I want to take you through the elevator problem specifically, because the elevator is in some ways the cleaner argument. The official history of the vertical transportation problem is that before Elisha Otis demonstrated his safety elevator in 1852, and before steam-powered elevators became practical in the 1870s, upper floors of tall buildings were, for practical purposes, not usable by ordinary occupants. You could not run a commercial or administrative operation on the 8th floor of a building if getting to the 8th floor required climbing 8 flights of stairs. Therefore, for practical purposes, buildings before the elevator era didn't need to be tall, and when they were tall, the upper floors were not used for primary functions. Except that the buildings I'm describing, the ones whose window proportion anomalies suggest structural systems more sophisticated than their official construction dates account for, are frequently documented in the administrative records and the contemporary accounts of the cities they stand in as having been fully occupied at height. Not marginally occupied, not occupied by the poorest residents who couldn't get anything better. Fully occupied for primary administrative and commercial functions at stories above the practical climbing limit. And in some cases, the contemporary accounts of these occupants mention no particular difficulty or exceptionality about reaching their upper floor spaces. As if access was not the problem the official elevator limitation narrative says it should have been. What resolved the access problem before the Otis elevator? The official account says nothing resolved it, and therefore the buildings were not used as I'm describing, and the contemporary accounts are unreliable or have been misread. But that is a very convenient form of circular reasoning. The official account says the technology didn't exist. Therefore, any evidence that the technology existed must be wrong. This is not analysis. This is the protection of a narrative against the evidence that would revise it. The alternative is more interesting and more difficult. If some of the buildings officially dated to the pre-elevator era were in fact built with vertical access systems we don't know about, or with vertical access systems that the official history has assigned later dates, or were not built in the pre-elevator era at all, but inherited from a previous construction period that predates the official timeline, then the history of when vertical construction became possible needs to be revisited. And the cities where those buildings concentrate, the cities of the inheritance period, the cities where the official history of 19th century construction is most strained, are the cities where the evidence is most available to examine, if anyone decides to examine it. The skyscraper, the official history says, was invented in Chicago in 1885. Before that, tall buildings were limited. The technology didn't exist. And everything that doesn't fit that narrative is an anomaly, an architectural curiosity, an interesting exception that the general rule holds around. I keep looking at the exceptions. I keep noticing that they cluster. I keep finding that the buildings in whose presence I feel most strongly that the official story is incomplete are the buildings in the cities that appear most consistently in the context of the civilization the maps call Tartaria. I keep finding that the timeline of what was possible and when is, in these specific cases, in these specific cities, specifically wrong. The towers still stand. The window proportions are still measurable. The load calculations can still be run. The evidence is in the buildings, for anyone willing to measure it and ask what it means. If the buildings that cluster in the cities of the inheritance period are carrying structural evidence of technology that the official timeline says didn't exist yet, what does that mean for the history of when vertical construction actually became possible? And who actually built what we're standing in? Leave your analysis in the comments and share this with anyone who has ever looked at an old building and felt something didn't quite add up.